No, conservatives. George Floyd's death was not the least bit justified. George Floyd was not even 0.0001% at fault for his own death. Derek Chauvin's actions were done out of pure sadism, and there is no extenuating circumstance that even remotely undermines his culpability. More importantly, the Black Lives Matter movement was absolutely justified, riots and all. What's up, guys? Acerthorn here, and this is Purple Politics. The murder of George Floyd is a shockingly controversial topic even to this day. I say shockingly because, quite frankly, it shouldn't be controversial. It was a black and white case of cold-blooded murder and a blatant case of police dick-wagging. But for a few exceptionally delusional people, the lengths they will go to in order to try and portray this as anything other than a cold-blooded murder done out of pure sadism is astounding. Enter Chase Rants, a police officer turned TikToker who supports giving police carte blanche to kill at the slightest provocation. He is by no means the only person who has parroted the arguments this video is designed to address, but he's compiled the most common arguments in a handy, digestible fashion that I can use as a framework and jumping off point to facilitate this video's discussion. Strangely enough, when I asked him to talk to me on Discord, where I could type out messages much longer than I can on TikTok, and where we can even share sources with each other to better understand each other's points, he straight up refused. He said that I can simply provide my rebuttals in the TikTok comments, knowing full well they are far too limiting for me to flesh out my arguments properly. The fucking coward. He refused to engage with me on an app that actually put us on a level playing field, which, in my opinion, is awfully telling of just how confident he is in the sound bites he's spewing. So I decided to make this YouTube video, where I have the time and elbow room I need to actually properly develop my arguments with facts, sources, and logic. If anyone out there, including rants, would like to make some rebuttal arguments against me, by all means be my guest. But I expect all rebuttals to be accompanied with sources, and for the record, all of my sources are in the link in the description down below. And I expect you to actually substantially address the actual meat and potatoes of my arguments. That is to say, if all you do is point out minor inconsistencies in what I say that don't actually substantially change the points I'm making, I'm going to just assume that the heart of my arguments really is sound logic.
So the thing here is it's not so cut and dry like you're implying. There were a lot of variables.
No, there isn't. There is absolutely no nuance to it, except the fake nuance that people like you attempt to manufacture. People like you just regurgitate the long disproven counter-arguments in defense of Chauvin's absolutely indefensible actions, and you refuse to accept that you're wrong no matter how many times your claims have been disproven.
But even if it was cold-blooded, nobody waited for those facts before seizing the opportunity to riot for days and weeks on end across the country.
I'm honestly surprised you didn't drop dead on the spot from irony poisoning. You criticize us for not waiting for the facts, yet you yourself jumped to conclusion after conclusion without even attempting to do any actual fact checking. So with that being said, let's discuss the controversy that is George Floyd's death. First, let's get the basics out of the way. Derek Chauvin killed George Floyd. Alright, that's a done deal. Derek Chauvin killed George Floyd, and there's no two ways about it. Moreover, it was an act of cold-blooded murder done out of pure sadism. It was domination for its own sake. How do I know this? Because at trial, Chauvin never attempted to argue that his actions were somehow justified under the circumstances. He never attempted to claim self-defense, legitimate use of force, or anything else. His entire defense at trial was that his actions were not the actual factual cause of death. However, it is clear beyond any doubt that his actions were indeed the cause of death. At trial, the coroner said point blank that Floyd would not have died were it not for Chauvin's neck compression.
I believe the primary mechanism of death is asphyxia or low oxygen. There's no evidence to suggest he would have died that night, except for the interactions with law enforcement.
So unless you've got some serious rebuttal evidence, then I trust the experts in this case, who both examined George Floyd's corpse firsthand and have the medical know-how to actually know what the fuck they were looking at when they examined the body. In response to this overwhelming evidence, Chauvin's legal defense put up one of the stupidest counter-arguments I've ever seen, and yet I've seen plenty of cop apologists regurgitate this counter-argument unironically because the number of people who have precisely zero ability to think for themselves is astounding. Their counter-argument was that because George Floyd was able to form speech in his last moments, that alone was sufficient proof that he in fact could breathe, which in turn means that Derek Chauvin was legally justified in exercising his police discretion when he chose not to believe that Floyd was likely lying when he said he couldn't breathe. Fuck you! Does literally anyone stop to think about this argument for even a second? Have any of you cop apologists actually used your brains for even once in your miserable fucking lives? Tell me, let me ask you, do any of you have any scientific proof whatsoever that proves that this argument actually holds? First of all, you don't actually define what it means to be able to breathe, and that's an important step you completely overlook. For me, when I heard George Floyd say he couldn't breathe, I didn't interpret that as there was literally zero oxygen molecules going into his lungs. I mean, he was deprived of 99% of the oxygen he needed to survive. If I have a kitchen faucet that only gives a tiny little drizzle whenever I turn the knobs all the way open, nobody in their right mind would seriously argue that I don't have a clogged sink. That being said, the only way George Floyd's pleas that he couldn't breathe could actually be significantly doubted to the point where Chauvin would have even a scintilla of discretion to believe that Floyd was exaggerating the danger he was in and refused to let up accordingly, is if we define able to breathe not as having a non-zero amount of oxygen coming in, but having enough oxygen to actually sustain your body's life processes without any long-term damage to any of your body's organs or tissues. So, that being said, does anyone out there have literally any scientific proof demonstrating that simply by dint of George Floyd being capable of forming coherent words in any capacity, he necessarily had enough oxygen going into his lungs, not coming out but going in, that he could have survived? Can anyone produce any peer-reviewed scientific research showing that human speech is physically impossible for a person who is unable to breathe, as defined earlier? Physical impossibility is the only excuse I would accept in this case, because that's the only level of scientific proof that would actually give Chauvin a genuine justification for deciding that Floyd was faking it. Literally, Floyd's entire legal defense at this stage of the trial begins and ends with, well, he was able to say he couldn't breathe, so checkmate. But there is absolutely no science whatsoever backing up this absurd claim. Moreover, even if this could be proven to be true, that it is indeed physically impossible for anyone to be able to speak if they genuinely can't breathe, that still doesn't excuse Chauvin. All that would mean is that cops like Chauvin now take on a duty to consider on their own accord whether detainees can breathe, and they should be required to familiarize themselves with the human respiratory system so they can make informed judgments thereof, because otherwise the scientific finding that speech is impossible to someone who is in danger of asphyxiation-related injuries would put George Floyd and others in his position in an impossible catch-22. As it currently stands, police are under no obligation to consider whether a suspect can breathe unless they speak out and notify the officer that they can't breathe. If they don't say that, the police can claim plausible deniability. But if they do say that, then by your own logic, they've suddenly proven their own complaints to be lies. Like Joe Heller's eponymous novel, this Catch-22 exhibits an elliptical precision about its perfect pairs of parts that is both graceful and shocking. So no matter how you slice it, Floyd being able to say he couldn't breathe is not the gotcha or even the partial mitigating factor that so many Chauvin apologists claim it to be. Chauvin refused to let up on his neck compression, not because he genuinely felt that Floyd was faking it when he said he couldn't breathe, but because, as I mentioned earlier, his actions were pure sadism. They were domination for its own sake, and this finding was reflected in Chauvin's sentencing. After he was convicted, the judge gave Chauvin an above-average sentence and cited the particular cruelty that he showed his victim as a major reason for the enhanced sentence. So, all in all, the simple bottom line is that Derek Chauvin killed George Floyd. It was not self-defense. It was not justified in any capacity, and Chauvin never even attempted to argue that it was justified. It was pure sadism, a cold-blooded murder done solely to assert dominance for its own sake. Deal with it. So, once the cause of death is proven beyond all reasonable doubt, cop apologists often point to a lot of other things in a frivolous and malicious attempt to shift blame onto George Floyd. This is where the aforementioned Chase Rants starts spouting off his bullshit. The first of these garbage attempts at blatant blame shifting is that Floyd was committing a crime, and that if he simply hadn't committed that crime, this wouldn't have happened. Okay, first of all, even if that were true, that didn't give Chauvin the right to fucking murder him just to teach him a lesson. At best, this gives Chauvin probable cause to arrest him, and then let the prosecutors and courts perform their role in the criminal justice system. Newsflash, you fucking corruption-enabling twats. We don't live in the Elder Scrolls universe where guards will run up to us on sight and pronounce us guilty on the spot, serving as our judge, jury, and executioner and handing down punishments without us getting even so much as a single sentence to tell our side of the story. In the real world, we have something. You might have heard of it. It's called the constitutional right to due process of law. Even if Floyd was guilty of a crime, an allegation I'll discuss momentarily, that still did not give Chauvin the right to be his judge, jury, and executioner. But even barring that, I ask you this. Exactly what crime was George Floyd even wanted for in the first place? According to my research, his only crime at the moment was attempting to pass a counterfeit $20 bill in order to buy some cigarettes. That's it. That's literally all he was wanted for at the time. Seriously? That's your excuse for saying that Floyd needed to be taught a lesson? I'm sorry, but a crime like that is on par with fucking jaywalking or running a red light. In fact, it's even less serious than that, since the tickets you get for those offenses typically cost you a hell of a lot more than just $20. I'm sorry, but if you want to argue that Floyd got what he deserved simply because he shouldn't have been breaking the law, you're gonna have to do a hell of a lot better than that. In fact, this so-called crime is so insignificant that it isn't even illegal under Minnesota law at all. Yeah, I actually checked the statute in Minnesota because, unlike you, I actually do a little bit of fact-checking before I start running my goddamn mouth. As it turns out, counterfeiting is only a crime in that state if the value being counterfeited is $1,000 or more. Now, it's admittedly been a few years since I was in second grade, but I vaguely remember something I learned in second grade about an alligator eating a bunch of ducks. And based on that thing that I vaguely remember, something tells me that $20 is just a teeny bit less than $1,000. Then again, it has been a minute or two since I was in second grade, so maybe my memory is just fuzzy. Now, sure, it's still a crime under federal law as well, but it definitely goes to show just how insignificant this so-called crime actually was. It certainly isn't significant enough to justify people claiming that he had it coming simply because he was breaking the law. But even barring all of that, there is still no evidence that Floyd had actually committed a crime in the first place. Sure, the $20 bill he tried to spend was confirmed to be counterfeit, but don't you know that's only one essential element of any criminal offense? Every criminal charge has two things that need to be proven in order to convict the defendant: actus reus and mens rea. Actus reus is the guilty act. He paid with a counterfeit $20 bill. That much is established. But mens rea, also known as criminal intent, has not been proven at all. The federal statute, the only statute he even could potentially be charged under, given the value of the counterfeit money, clearly requires that the defendant must have acted with intent to defraud. This is something that even the store clerk who took his money acknowledged was a necessary element of a criminal offense. So if you can't prove that Floyd knew his money was counterfeit, you can't prove he committed a crime, which means that your excuse that he got what he deserved simply because he broke the law, already a completely bullshit attempt at blame shifting even in the best case scenario, completely crumbles at the foundation. No matter how you slice it, whether it be because your counter-arguments are wholly unsupported by evidence, or because they don't actually justify anything Chauvin did that fateful day, even if they were supported by evidence, the bottom line remains the same. Floyd's criminality, what little there was, does not mitigate Chauvin's culpability in any way, shape, or form. Next on the list of constantly regurgitated talking points in defense of Chauvin's absolutely untenable behavior is the argument that he was resisting arrest.
There were a lot of variables, such as him physically resisting arrest.
Okay, once again, just like with the counterfeit money, even if this were true, this does not legally or ethically give Derek Chauvin the right to fucking murder George Floyd by kneeling on his neck until he was dead. Even if, at some point in the entire altercation, George Floyd might have done something that could arguably be considered resisting arrest, more on that in a little bit, he certainly wasn't resisting arrest for the 8 solid minutes that Chauvin had his goddamn knee on his goddamn neck. That's an important distinction to make because police only have the power to use force reasonably necessary to stop people from resisting arrest. Once the attempt to resist arrest has been stopped, so too does the officer's authority to use force to stop it. Regardless of what Floyd might have done before the cameras began filming, Chauvin absolutely cannot justify his decision to take the law into his own hands and summarily punish and even summarily execute Floyd as extrajudicial punishment for this alleged crime. In one Ask Reddit post asking cops how they feel about the George Floyd incident, one man who claims to be a cop in Texas throws his 2 cents into the ring. In pertinent part, he writes, "Even if Floyd did attempt to resist or escape, there was no reason to hold him down for 8 minutes. What was the point of restraining him for so long? Why did the other officer not assist the primary officer with restraining Floyd so they could get him in the patrol unit quicker? Why did the primary officer continue to restrain Floyd by his neck after Floyd became unresponsive? Why can the officer be heard at some point asking Floyd if he is still a tough guy? I can only come up with one answer to all of these questions, and that was the primary officer, Chauvin, wanted to prove to Floyd that Floyd was not such a tough guy. I see an officer assaulting another human being, going beyond taking control of a suspect, using force as punishment, and ultimately causing the death of another human being. I see a second officer who stood and watched and did nothing, despite knowing that what the first officer was doing was a violation of law and policy. I see officers who were trying to get back at Floyd for running his mouth and resisting an arrest by using force they knew could result in death or serious bodily injury in a situation that did not justify using deadly force. This officer committed murder, plain and simple. fucking bingo. But even if we assume that Floyd resisting arrest might have mitigated Chauvin's culpability to some extent, that still doesn't actually save Chauvin, because again, just like with Floyd allegedly committing a crime in the first place, the evidence that Floyd actually tried to resist arrest is scant at best. Surveillance video from the store Floyd was shopping in before he was arrested actually contradicts the police report saying he resisted arrest. I'm sorry, but what was that you were saying about waiting for the facts? Well, here, you didn't wait for the facts before you believed that Floyd was resisting arrest entirely on Chauvin's uncorroborated word. You fucking hypocrites. See, this is why we have due process of law. Police shouldn't be allowed to simply dole out punishments summarily just because they personally feel like someone is resisting arrest. Again, we do not live in the Elder Scrolls universe, where resisting arrest causes the guards to immediately attack and even kill you on the spot. In the real world, resisting arrest is grounds for a separate criminal charge, in addition to the one you were under arrest for in the first place. But even that still has to go through the DA and the courts in order to truly stick, just like every other crime he could potentially be charged with. Police do not have the right to just issue summary executions to anyone they, in their arbitrary and sole discretion, decide is resisting arrest. Oh, and as if that weren't enough, once their allegations of resisting arrest were contradicted with surveillance camera footage, they actually had the audacity, they actually had the balls to spin the narrative and try to argue that Floyd's claiming he couldn't breathe was in itself a form of resisting arrest. Oh my God. I'm not even going to bother explaining just what's so goddamn stupid about this argument. If you honestly can't see the problem yourself, you're clearly too far gone. You have already drunk the conservative Kool-Aid so much that there's no saving you. Suffice it to say, this has got to be the absolute dumbest argument made in defense of law enforcement brutality since that. Last but not least, there's the fact that the autopsy revealed presence of drugs in Floyd's system at the time of death. Police apologists will cling to this fact like it's their fucking firstborn and insist, without any evidence whatsoever, that this was the real cause of death.
There were a lot of variables, such as the drugs in Floyd's system.
Now, unlike Floyd committing a counterfeit crime or Floyd allegedly resisting arrest, this is at least factually true. Yes, the autopsy report does indeed state that Floyd's body contained trace amounts of fentanyl and meth. But you know what it doesn't say? That these drugs were, in fact, the actual cause of death. In fact, the various medical experts who testified in Chauvin's trial unanimously testified that drug overdose was not the cause of death.
Medical expert after expert drew this conclusion. George Floyd did not die because of drugs.
I believe the primary mechanism of death is asphyxia or low oxygen.
In my opinion, the law enforcement subdual restraint and the neck compression was just more than Mr. Floyd could take by virtue of those heart conditions. Mr. Floyd's use of fentanyl did not cause the subdual or neck restraint. His heart disease did not cause the subdual or the neck restraint.
What was that you said earlier? Something about not waiting for the facts before you jump to conclusions? Here, you don't even have to wait for the facts. The facts are already on public record for all the world to see. All you had to do was simply fucking find the facts. You know, this reminds me of an argument I had on this channel a few weeks ago with some guy named Voice of the People. In it, he argued that I should have to do my own research rather than simply criticize other people for not providing their research. Well, the fact that Floyd's drugs are still a talking point to this very day, years after the experts unanimously shot it down as a relevant factor in his death, just proves that I'm right about the issue of citing sources. It isn't simply that I could do the research myself. It's the fact that people should be required to cite their sources as a matter of course, because if people aren't required to cite their sources as a matter of course, people often fail to do basic fact-checking on things because they don't think they need to. This means that they continue to believe things that have long been debunked 11 ways to Sunday, things that they could easily verify as having long been debunked simply because of their laziness. Then they proceed to go on social media and regurgitate the same unsourced garbage they heard other people spout without evidence, resulting in a telephone game of misinformation that could have been avoided if we, as a society, adopted a policy of requiring people to provide their sources in the first instance. It isn't so much about my refusal to do research to correct this misinformation. After all, I'm clearly doing my research for this video. Rather, it's about preventing this sort of misinformation from being able to spread in the first place. But, for the sake of argument, let's say there's a sliver of truth to this. There's not, but I'm just playing devil's advocate at the moment. For the sake of argument, let's assume that the drugs in Floyd's system might have contributed to his death. To that I ask, what the fuck does this change in real, actual fucking real terms? Because even if we assume that Floyd's drugs might have contributed to his death, that still doesn't negate the fact that Chauvin's knee also contributed to it. Whether Chauvin's knee was the sole cause of death, or whether his knee simply brought Floyd's health from a D- down to an F, it ultimately doesn't matter, because Chauvin is still legally liable for causing Floyd's death all the same. The bottom line remains that Floyd would not have died that day if Chauvin hadn't killed him, and that has not been disproven simply because there happen to be drugs in his system. Here's a hypothetical example to help you understand. Imagine if someone is in the hospital, lying on his deathbed. The doctor says he only has 2 to 3 hours to live. Then, all of a sudden, I come in and start wailing on the guy, causing him to die in about 2 to 3 minutes instead of 2 to 3 hours. At trial, I argue that he was gonna die anyway. Unlike George Floyd, here it is a foregone conclusion that he was going to die, and he was going to die quite soon. So rather than causing his death in the first instance, I only made it happen just a little bit quicker than it otherwise would have happened. In that scenario, do I deserve to walk? Of fucking course not. That would be ridiculous. Therefore, even if we accept that Floyd's drugs were a contributing factor in his death, which has already been debunked 11 ways to Sunday even then, the only way this actually changes anything in this entire controversy is if Chauvin's actions didn't actually contribute to Floyd's death, that he didn't even so much as expedite Floyd's death, let alone cause it in the first instance, since there is absolutely plenty of evidence to prove that Chauvin's actions were, in fact, the but-for cause of Floyd's death. Chauvin still deserves to be locked up in prison right now. It's like I said earlier, there is no nuance to any of this, aside from the square-shaped nuance that police apologists like Chase Rance are attempting to shove into this round-shaped, morally black and white hole. There's insufficient evidence that he committed a crime that day. The crime he was wanted for was the epitome of a petty offense, even if he was guilty of it. There is no evidence that Floyd actually resisted arrest, and even either of those things were true, it still wouldn't have justified Chauvin's actions, and the drugs were not the cause of death. It was murder, plain and simple, cold-blooded murder done out of pure sadism, and no, there is no extenuating circumstance. Get over it. So now that we've established the moral black and whiteness surrounding Floyd's death, let's finally talk about the thing that Rance was actually criticizing, the violence of the BLM protests. Rance, and others like him, insist that even if Chauvin's actions were wrong, two wrongs don't make a right, and it was equally wrong for the BLM protesters to cause so much property damage.
Protesters shouldn't have lit buildings on fire in response. One evil does not counteract the other. There are much better ways to get your point across than the act of rioting.
You know, for somebody who criticizes BLM for not waiting for the facts, you don't seem to be willing to do even the most rudimentary of fact-checking yourself. If you had done literally a single Google search, you would have found source after source showing that the vast majority of BLM protesters were, in fact, peaceful. That most of the people who were arrested were let off without charges and were found to be acting entirely within their First Amendment rights. Rather, it was the police, not the protesters, who portrayed 99.99% of arrested persons as rioters as a crowd control tactic in order to portray the protests as being much more violent than they actually were. This wasn't even an overzealous but good faith overreaction by well-intended cops, but was instead a cold, calculated, and time-tested means of intentionally defaming the protesters. They knew what they were doing and were absolutely malicious and corrupt about it. Now, sure, there were a few documented cases of vandalism and even arson that were loosely connected to the BLM protests. However, there are two problems with these examples that police apologists conveniently ignore. First, there is no evidence that these acts of vandalism are in fact an actual part of the BLM protests. Whenever there are protests, these protests are inevitably going to attract criminals, people who don't really give a damn about whatever the protests are for and simply want to use the unrest as a cloak so they can do a little bash and snatch, just grab some jewelry from a window and make off with it. As such, while there is evidence of violent crimes being committed in close proximity to BLM protests, proving that these violent crimes were actually part of the protests is a different story. And since the burden of proof always lies on the prosecution, not the defense, it's up to you to prove that these violent crimes were actually part of the protests, not my burden to prove that they weren't. That's the first problem with these crimes. The second is that they represent an infinitesimal portion of the total BLM arrests. As I showed earlier, the vast majority of BLM protesters quickly had their charges dropped. The police and the media take a handful of clips of violent behavior and play them on a loop to make it look like the BLM protesters are just violent rioters. This honestly reminds me of another soundbite that police apologists often like to spew out without actually stopping to consider the implications of what they're saying. It's just a few bad apples. It's just a few bad apples. It's just a few bad apples. Of course, that logic only really holds when you're defending police brutality, doesn't it? Now, unlike you, I am actually going to address the double standard I'm sure you're accusing me of right now. How come I insist that it's only a few bad apples when it comes to the BLM protests turned riots, but I scoff at the exact same logic being applied to police corruption? Well, for two reasons. First, as I mentioned a moment ago, this is only the second of two extenuating circumstances. My other argument was that there was little, if any, evidence that the vandals were in fact part of the BLM protests, or if they were just taking advantage of the fact that people's attention was diverted by the protests so they could hopefully slip under the radar. By contrast, there is no dispute that police officers who act brazenly and with egregious excessive force are, in fact, part of the overall police population. They really are representing the police when they engage in these blatant acts of police brutality, and there's no two ways about it. Second, and I really need you to pay attention on this next bit because it's very important, the BLM protesters have no legal obligation to restrain vandals while they're protesting, whereas police officers do indeed have a legal duty to apprehend and arrest other cops who are breaking the law. That alone creates a world of difference between BLM getting blamed for the unrelated rioters and the police as a whole getting blamed for the actions of, as you put it, a few bad apples. This is why Officers Quing, Lane, and Thao were all charged and ultimately sentenced for being accessories to Floyd's murder when they stood by and did nothing. But the countless civilians who stood by and watched in horror weren't charged with anything despite them being guilty of the exact same thing. The difference is that police officers have a duty to intervene, whereas private citizens don't. Therefore, the whole "it's just a few bad apples" argument, when applied in defense of police officers, doesn't really hold up to scrutiny because anytime a cop stands back and doesn't intervene whenever a so-called bad apple breaks the law, he becomes a bad apple himself. And at that point, you've got a hell of a lot more than just a few bad apples on your hands. But okay, let's assume for a minute that neither of those things are true. The vandalism was indeed part of the BLM protests, rather than concurrent to, but independent of them. Furthermore, let's also assume that these acts of violence are in fact more than an infinitesimal portion of the total BLM protests. Even then, the riots were still justified. I mentioned this in the comments of his videos, although since I was limited to 150 characters a pop, I wasn't able to fully flesh out the arguments.
Sometimes sacrifices need to be made for the greater good. Riots are the only way. BLM committed treason because it's the only thing that works. I mean, at this point, if this guy isn't on a watch list somewhere, I would be shocked.
Oh, wow. So you think that I deserve to be on a watch list just because of the things I say in a TikTok comment? I'm not even threatening anyone. My comments are the very definition of political speech. And you say that I deserve to be on a fucking watch list because of that. Clearly, you don't believe in free speech. Hey, you said it, not me. Anyway, I love how he conveniently ignores the two counterexamples I gave about Brailsford and Yanez. Twice I gave these two as counterexamples, and he even showed them on screen, but he completely failed to acknowledge them. Now, to be fair, I was limited to 150 characters and thus didn't have enough space to properly flesh out my arguments like I'm about to do, so maybe he just didn't fully understand exactly why these two counterexamples are so important. That being said, I still feel he shouldn't have ignored these counterexamples completely. If he was actually interested in good faith discussion, he would have made at least some attempt to try and anticipate what my point was for including them. So for the two of you who care enough about police brutality to be interested in watching a video like this, yet still don't know exactly who Philip Brailsford and Geronimo Yanez are, for the two of you who are like that, they both killed innocent victims, Daniel Shaver and Philando Castile respectively, despite there being absolutely no evidence that their lives were actually in danger. Philando Castile had a gun on him, but he insisted he wasn't reaching for it. And there was absolutely no evidence that he was, in fact, reaching for it. Meanwhile, Daniel Shaver had no weapon at all when he was killed by Philip Brailsford. Both Brailsford and Yanez were charged with murder, but they were both acquitted. And why were they acquitted? Because even though there was absolutely no objective evidence that either one was in danger, they still claimed that they thought they were in danger. They didn't even claim they were actually in danger, just that they thought they were. That alone was enough to get them off. They were both acquitted solely because of what they subjectively believed. At least with Yanez, there was no evidence proving that Castile was actually reaching for his gun, but there was still that slight possibility that he might have been. Slight being the key word. But with Philip Brailsford, it was later confirmed that Daniel Shaver didn't have a weapon at all, meaning that Brailsford's belief that Shaver was reaching for a weapon was based on absolutely nothing but paranoia. All because Daniel Shaver didn't fold his body up like a goddamn contortionist for the cops' demented amusement.
I said keep your legs crossed! Hands in the air! Hands up in the air! You do that again, we're shooting you, do you understand?
Please do not shoot me.
Then listen to my instructions!
I'm trying to do what you
Don't talk, listen! Hands straight up in the air. Do not put your hands down for any reason. You think you're gonna fall, you better fall on your face. Your hands go back in the small of your back or down. We are going to shoot you. Do you understand me?
Yes, sir.
Crawl towards me. Crawl towards me!
Yes, sir.
This, ladies and gentlemen, paints a perfect picture of the legal and political climate when it comes to police brutality in this country. When a private citizen claims a self-defense, he either has to prove that he was genuinely in danger, or he has to prove that his belief that he was in danger was objectively reasonable. It depends on the state. But for a police officer in all 50 states, they don't have to prove diddly squat. They just have to say those 6 magic words: I was scared for my life. And then the burden of proof shifts to the prosecution to prove not just that his belief was unreasonable, but that he subjectively didn't actually believe it, and that he's flat out lying when he said he thought he was in danger. These 2 examples are admittedly extreme examples, but they are far from the only examples of police brutality where the police suffer absolutely no accountability. There are hundreds of examples of police engaging in extremely excessive force, far above and far beyond what the situation actually calls for. Sometimes even planting fucking evidence so they have an excuse to arrest people and not getting punished for it. As you can clearly see, we've tried multiple times over the years to actually take the peaceful approach to holding police accountable for their blatant corruption, with cases like Daniel Shaver, Philandro Castile, Eric Garner, Stephen Clark, Freddie Gray, and many, many others. We tried to do it the peaceful way, and it simply didn't fucking work. You admonish the BLM protesters because they didn't wait for the facts before resorting to rioting? Well, we don't have to wait for the facts when we already know from multiple past experiences how this is likely going to go down if we simply trust the system.
BLM did one good thing, got Derek Chauvin convicted. Were it not for BLM, he would have been acquitted. This one's wild to me because you're implying Chauvin was only convicted due to straight up witness tampering and jury intimidation.
Yeah, you're completely missing the point. The problem isn't that cops are routinely crucified in the court of public opinion despite a complete lack of evidence. The problem is that the law purports on its face to give cops the power to kill innocent, unarmed civilians like Daniel Shaver and Philandro Castile, who haven't done a damn thing wrong just because they're in a bad mood. This is something that the law purports on its face to empower police to do. That is why riots were necessary, not to force the jury to convict despite a lack of evidence, but to force the prosecutor to actually do his job and genuinely prosecute Chauvin, rather than doing the half-assed performative prosecutions that Brailsford and Yanez both got. Here's the thing a lot of police apologists seem to completely ignore. The BLM protests didn't just come out of nowhere. The death of George Floyd was not the only thing that pushed these protesters over the edge. Quite the opposite, it was the straw that broke the camel's back. For years and years, we have been demanding police reform and police accountability only for our peaceful demands to consistently fall on deaf ears. George Floyd's death was not taken in isolation. Rather, it was the culmination of years and years of this crap. Injustice after injustice has finally caused us to snap, and we are done playing nice. It honestly reminds me of a fairly recent Reddit post that appeared on my TikTok For You page fairly recently. It was called "I am done and I am heartbroken. I have no one." This details the supposedly true story where he's gone several years with hardly any affection, attention, reciprocation, or appreciation of any kind from his wife or daughters. When he finally snaps, his wife believes that this came completely out of nowhere, and that he never spoke about this problem before now, even though he thoroughly explains that nothing could be further from the truth. When it comes to the people having had it up to here with police killing people left, right, and center, we're faced with effectively the same dilemma. Police apologists merely think that the BLM violence is just coming out of nowhere, but that's only because the previous attempts to peacefully protest the brutal and senseless killing of all of these other people fell on deaf ears. So now that we're upping the ante, they only think that this is coming out of nowhere because the types of protests they claim they want don't fucking work. This isn't even the first time riots were condemned by the establishment when they were proven to be the only thing that actually works. Remember 2014? Remember Ferguson, Missouri? Police apologists like to pretend that those riots were done solely out of outrage over the death of Michael Brown. Like Floyd, Brown was not the sole catalyst of the riots, but rather the straw that broke the camel's back. There was pent-up aggression in Ferguson for quite some time prior to these riots breaking out over the general corruption of the police and municipal courts. Brown was not the sole cause of the riots. He just happened to be the specific point where the people had finally reached the end of their tether. Put simply, people riot in response to police killings because it's the only thing that actually works. Riots are scary, both for the people watching them and for the people engaging in them, but they're the only thing we've tried so far that seems to get any kind of results. So in one final, extremely desperate attempt to convince people that violence isn't the answer, police apologists often point to Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement as an example of true change coming about through nonviolent activism.
Other ways to get your point across. Name one that actually works. Have you ever heard of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? Does I Have a Dream ring any bells? He united the masses peacefully and used only his words to do so.
Now, before I continue, I want to point something out. When I was planning on making this video, I obviously went and found sources for this video, since I strongly believe in providing one's sources in the first instance, rather than simply regurgitating what I believe to be true and laying the burden of proof on other people to find rebuttal evidence to prove me wrong. As I mentioned earlier, adopting this policy would heavily cut back on the amount of misinformation that gets spread around on social media, and this instance only proves what I suspected the whole time. When I first began making this video, I intended for my points to be that MLK's assassination actually predates the majority of the true triumphs in the civil rights movement, like the Supreme Court case of Brown v. Board of Education or the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. As such, I plan to argue that MLK didn't actually do or accomplish much of anything in his time, and he is only remembered posthumously, mostly for having a great speaking voice. However, it turns out that this isn't actually the case. As it turns out, not only was he assassinated in 1968, 4 years after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, but he was even physically present for when the president signed it into law. So I had to change this section of the script for this video to accommodate this new research. So the next time someone like this jackass scoffs at the idea that content creators should be expected to provide their sources in the first instance, keep in mind that if I hadn't followed that philosophy, I would have spread some serious misinformation in this section of the video. Now sure, it would be legal under the First Amendment for me to spread this misinformation, but it also wouldn't have been very conducive to a healthy discussion of the facts or the pursuit of a proper solution. So, it's just like I said earlier in this video. we should gravitate towards a social custom that requires content creators to provide their sources as a matter of course, because that will most likely cut down significantly on the amount of misinformation that gets spread. Alright, happy times are over, and now we're back to being pissed off, because even though he had to drop that portion of my argument, I still have a lot of stuff to talk about here. First of all, I find it extraordinarily telling that this is quite literally the only truly significant example anyone ever comes up with of nonviolent activism actually enjoying any significant amount of success. Literally the only example in the history of human activism from 3000 BC to the present. Frankly, if this is the only example you can come up with, chances are this is the exception and not the rule. But hey, let's give them the benefit of the doubt and assume that it isn't literally the only example they can find, even if they wanted to. Even barring that, there are still quite a few major differences between MLK's activism and what we're faced with today regarding police brutality. First, you say that MLK was a non-violent activist. No, he wasn't. He actually broke quite a few laws during his time. Many of these were what he considered to be unjust laws, but do you honestly think that the people in power in Alabama at the time actually felt that way? Just like how you admonish BLM protesters for breaking the law, obviously the Alabama establishment during King's time saw King as nothing more than a hooligan who broke the law whenever he personally decided he didn't like the law. Surely the government at the time gave just as few fucks about King's so-called unjust laws argument as you currently give about BLM's argument that violence is the only way. That was approximately 60 years ago. We are viewing MLK's actions from a position of 60 years of hindsight. 60 years from now, in the 2080s, when people of that time are viewing BLM's actions from a position of 60 years of hindsight, we have fuck all way of knowing what they're going to think about the crimes committed by the BLM rioters, if those rioters even were BLM for reasons I've already discussed. In fact, not only did MLK repeatedly break the law to make his point, but you seem to conveniently forget that the civil rights movement all got started in the first place because Rosa Parks, you guessed it, broke the law. That is universally understood to be the tipping point that actually got the wheels in motion for the civil rights movement to even happen in the first place. And it all began by a woman doing the very thing you say the BLM protesters shouldn't do. Speaking of Rosa Parks, that leads me to my next point. She did her little bus seat stunt in the year 1955. The Supreme Court case of Brown v. Board of Education was handed down in the year 1954, a good year before Rosa Parks got the balls, figuratively speaking of course, to stand up, or rather not stand up because she didn't give up her seat, for what she believed in. Could it be that the news of Brown v. Board is what finally gave her the courage to do what she did? Could that have been what actually emboldened her? Maybe, maybe not, but the overall point is this. The entirety of the civil rights movement took place in a post-Brown world. In other words, even if the civil rights movement was entirely peaceful, which the Southern governments of the time would vehemently dispute, they likely only got the results they did because segregation was already 1 foot in the grave to begin with. When the Supreme Court hands down a decision, it is exceptionally rare for them to change course in the span of a single generation. For example, Dobbs overturned Roe v. Wade, but only when the Supreme Court didn't have a single justice sitting on it that also sat for the Roe decision. It was literally a 100% different Supreme Court. In other words, even though Brown v. Board only applied to school segregation rather than general segregation, once it got handed down, it was still immediately clear that Jim Crow was living on borrowed time. Even discounting that victory that had already laid the foundation for them, we mustn't discount the extremely crucial first step to racial equality that had already been accomplished nearly a century prior: the abolition of slavery. And I got news for you, buddy, that absolutely did not come about in a peaceful manner. In fact, I'm actually going to break my own rule here and not provide a source to prove this, because frankly, if you don't already know about all the blood that was spilled in order to abolish slavery, you clearly have never taken a single U.S. history class in your entire miserable fucking life. Both of these things predate the civil rights movement and gave MLK a huge head start when it came to securing equal rights for black citizens. So the next time you try to compare BLM's plight to that of MLK's, keep in mind that MLK basically had 90% of the work already done for him, whereas BLM has to start from scratch. Speaking of comparing BLM and MLK, that leads me to my final point for this video. At the end of the day, the simple fact of the matter is that Martin Luther King Jr. fought for something very, very different than what Black Lives Matter is fighting for. Sure, they both fought for the rights of black people, but that's where the similarities end. King was fighting to end segregation and discrimination. Black Lives Matter is fighting to stop police from murdering black people in cold blood with no accountability. When it came to segregation, yeah, it was wrong, but it wasn't fatal to black people. Sure, they might have had to drink from a much shittier public water fountain than white people did, but at least they were surviving. Hell, a lot of the protests they did were literally designed to call attention to how much they didn't need these public accommodations at all, like how they would walk or carpool rather than take the bus. By contrast, people are literally fucking dying at the hands of corrupt police right now. While we are peacefully demanding greater equality at the hands of corrupt cops, what are we supposed to do in the meantime? Just submit to being murdered in cold blood? Are we supposed to just lay down and fucking die? See, when I asked Rants to name a method of getting our point across, one that actually works, what I mean is, we don't have the luxury of sitting by for 9 fucking years. This cannot wait. Every day, literally every single day, that proper reforms are not implemented, someone out there dies as a result of absolutely preventable police brutality. We cannot afford to wait patiently for anything other than immediate results, whereas MLK could. And that alone, even if you discount all other differences I've already mentioned, single-handedly requires we take far more drastic measures than what Martin Luther King Jr. took. So in conclusion, Derek Chauvin's actions were pure evil, and there is no nuance to this situation other than the fake nuance that conservatives attempt to manufacture. Floyd's crime does not justify Chauvin's actions. His alleged resisting arrest is unsupported by evidence, and even if it was, it still doesn't mean he deserved to die. There were drugs in his system, but they were not the cause of death. Meanwhile, BLM protests might have had a few nominal instances of violence erupting, but this violence is absolutely necessary because it's the only way anyone will listen. So police departments around the country need to get their act together, otherwise the rioting is only going to get worse. If you enjoyed this video, regardless of whether you agree with my opinion or not, be sure to subscribe for more Purple Politics videos. Once you've done that, check out my featured video for returning subscribers for ways you can support the channel through monetary donations on my Patreon, as well as over at my gaming channel. In the meantime, however, I am Acerthorn, and this has been Purple Politics.